All right, welcome everybody to Chapter 5, which deals with selecting employees. Those of the more observant of you will notice that the nasty Movember stash is now gone, and I am now clean shaven and even more good looking than normal. So, yeah, you'll have this clean shaven face for the rest of the lectures. So, rejoice all. Okay, so like I said, Chapter 5 deals with selection of employees, and selection of employees is probably the most visible part of human resource management. Oftentimes when we think of human resource management, we think of the job interview, and certainly the job interview is part of the selection process, but only a small part. So let's get to it. Okay, so key idea for this chapter here is a strong selection process includes a variety of legally permissible, valid, reliable, generalizable, and practical selection tools and processes, like interviews, tests, etc., that contribute to making a proper hiring decisions. Big mouthful. I'll just break it down briefly, and as always, we'll go through it in excruciating detail when we get to the lesson objectives. Okay, so when we talk about selection, oftentimes we think of, like I said, as job interview, but a selection process is much more than just a job interview. It uses a variety of what are called selection tools. And just to give you an example of other selection tools other than an interview, you would have things like tests, or things like reference check, or screening resumes. Okay, all those are different selection methods. All right, so a good selection process will have a variety of these things, and they must be legally permissible, valid, reliable, generalizable, and practical. All right, legally permissible you can probably figure out on your own. It's quite obvious. These other ones we'll go through in detail about what's valid, reliable, generalizable, and practical means. Okay. And then the process combines them all, right? So selection process combines all the tools, and you want to be able to use them properly like that, and you want to make the best possible hiring decision. Okay, fairly straight, quite a bit there, but fairly straightforward, and it'll be more clear as we go through it in the end. Okay, there's 5 learning objectives this time, and as always, we will go through it in the wait for it excruciating detail to follow. Learning objective number 1, identify the elements and legal requirements of the selection process. Keyword here being selection process. Okay, so what are the different parts, and what do we have to worry about in terms of the law? Very simple slide here. Selection. Through the process of selection, organizations make decisions about who will be chosen to fill job openings. Okay, again, really straightforward. Last chapter, and at the end of chapter 4, we talked about recruitment, getting that pool of applicants. Okay, selection then is the next step. Selection is selecting some of those people from the pool of applicants to go into the selection process, and then ultimately choosing the right candidate from that pool to fill the job opening. All right, like I said, fairly basic stuff. Okay, steps in the selection process. Makes a wonderful exam question, so make sure you know all 5 of these. All right, we'll go through them fairly quickly here. So it starts by, the first one is screening applications and resumes. So for example, if you were trying to hire 5 clerks or 5 servers at Tim Hortons, you might have a pool of, let's say, 25 different resumes and applications. So we'll go through that. We'll go through those, and we may come up with, whittle it down to maybe 10 people out of those, okay? And we'll screen based on something. One screening protocol might be they have to be available to work evenings and weekends. So if they indicated somewhere they weren't able to work evenings and weekends, they would be filtered out or screened out. Okay, so once you've winnowed down those pile of 100 or 50 or 25 resumes to a manageable number, generally speaking, probably 10 or less, if you're going for 2 or 3 positions. Then you get into the testing and review work samples. Okay, so testing can be things like you could do a typing test if it was an assistant. You could do a psychological test or an aptitude test if you're trying to figure out if somebody's suitable for a sales position. Work samples, look at a portfolio of work. So if you're hiring a graphic artist, what have you done? Show me some of the stuff that you've completed in graphic design. Okay, once you get through the testing, you've winnowed your pool down a little further, so maybe you get down to the interviewing candidates. And generally speaking, in most selection processes, if you're going for 1 or 2 jobs, you're probably down now to, anywhere between 3, maybe 5, maybe 6 different candidates that you're actually doing the job interview with. And we'll go through interviews. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? If you were a tree, what type of tree would you be? Tell me about a time when you did something at work that you didn't have to do. All right, an initiative question. So a variety of different questions. And an interview might even be more than one interview. Some jobs, in particular senior positions, there might be 2, 3, or even 4 different types of interviews. All right, once you've interviewed the clients, you get down to checking reference and background checks. Usually by this point, if it's a single position, you're down to 1, maybe 2 if you're still undecided. You're trying to confirm that, so check the references, see if they're a good person. Do a police check, make sure that they haven't got any thing in their criminal background that would prevent them from doing the job. And finally, the last part is making the selection, so making the job offers. So collectively then, those are the 5 steps: screening, testing, interviewing, checking reference, and making selections. So you should be able to walk through those with your own example. Okay, let's talk a little bit about legal standards. So the 2 areas of the law you really want to be cognizant of in selection are human rights and privacy. Mostly human rights, but also a little bit of a privacy as well. So, right. The key thing with human rights is being fair and unbiased. Okay, so you can't be using selection techniques or requirements that are result in unfair discrimination, unless, of course, the unfair discrimination is a BOFR, bona fide occupational qualification, and then you have a duty to accommodate. So think back to chapter 2 about that. Okay, so for example, I may have a requirement that all people hired are going to be males who are 6 feet and taller, because that represents our brand better if we have all these tall male guys working for us. Problem with that's runs into at least a number of proscribed grounds, right? Gender for one, and if it's a height requirement, again, that might have some unfair adverse effect on some nationalities or racial backgrounds, because some races tend to be taller than others. Okay, so I can't have, obviously, I can't have an unfair requirement like that. With the job interviews, okay, making sure you're asking questions that doesn't draw out information that's not relevant to the job. And I have a little bit of PTSD from a job interview I went back to in the mid-'80s. And this fellow who I was interviewing was actually a fairly high at that time I think he's vice president of human resources. And the 2 questions I got asked was, what does my father do? Okay, which I don't know how that was relevant for the job as a customer service rep at the time. And clearly discriminatory based on family background. And his other questions was, are you a married guy? And again, number of different grounds, that you can be jerked up on if you ask that particular question, but again, not relevant to the particular job, or directly relevant. All right. Interview notes cannot identify candidates based on any prohibited grounds. So if I put in my notes that the person was a large man of color who was wearing a turban, all right. Again, how is that relevant? But if someone puts a privacy request and that comes out, again, you're going to get jerked up on potentially human rights. The other thing is those notes should be kept private. Okay, not everybody should be, people who weren't in on the hiring decision shouldn't have access to those notes. So the privacy there. And finally, backgrounds and reference checks. Okay, two things: you can't solicit information from people who haven't been given as references. So your buddy may know the person who you're hiring. It's not kosher for you to go out and get input from your buddy about this particular person if your buddy hasn't been given as a reference, right? That's anyway, it's not a kosher or legal thing to do. The other thing about reference checks and background checks is don't ask for things like the social insurance number or place of birth, okay, beforehand, before you're hiring a person, because that can give, from a privacy concern, obviously, because at that point you don't need them. Okay, you'll need the social insurance number and you'll need a place of birth or an address once you've hired the person, but don't ask beforehand, because again, you could run into human rights, privacy, because you're collecting private information that you don't need, and then human rights because you may reveal things about ethnic background that are irrelevant to the hiring decisions. Okay, so let's cycle back then for that first objective here. Identify the elements and legal requirements of the search process. And what do I want to say about that? I want us to recap. Okay, so selection process then has 5 steps: screening, testing, interview, reference checks, and choosing the candidate. Know each one. And secondly, the laws and legal requirements, be particularly cognizant of human rights, asking questions or putting in requirements that result in unfair discrimination, and also privacy, asking for private information that you don't need, and secondly, safeguarding any private information that was given in the job interview. Okay, objective number 2, define the measures of success for a selection method. Okay, so essentially what we're saying here is your selection method, so your test, your interview question, your requirement. Is that a good thing? And good will be gauged on a number of different bases, things like validity, reliability, practicality. Okay, so define ways to measure success of your selection method. All right, 2 slides here, so let's dive into it. Now, criteria for a effective selection method. The first one is it needs to be valid, and that it measures what it purports to be measuring. Okay, so let's say that you have a typing test, which is a measurement of somebody's typing speed. And you have correlated that high performance or good performance or a good enough performance on a typing test correlates with high performance as a administrative assistant. If you were able to do that, then the typing test would be a valid test, measures what it purports to be measuring, typing speed, right? Now, if we measured it on a manual typewriter, probably not so good, but if you use the actual typewriter, boy, that's an old, how about computer? Yeah, let's get with the 1980s here, Bill, or 1990s. All right, so yeah, so if you're using the same type of computer keyboard that you have on the job, that would be a valid test. So measuring typing speed, and typing speed correlates with high performance as an admin assistant. Okay, so I would say that would be a valid test. let's say, give you another example. Let's say we're going to have a swimsuit contest to help choose the next human resource management instructor. Now I'll let you put that, get this into your head bit, and this will traumatize you. So we got a whole bunch of old men, and then maybe the odd middle-aged women, and they're strutting their stuffs in a swimsuit. Okay, they come out on the runway, and then everybody rates it. Oh, that guy's a 10, that guy's a 5, that guy's a 2. Ignore the human rights problem here. But we'll talk, is this a valid measurement of effectiveness of an instructor? Okay, so what are we measuring with the swimsuit contest? Well, maybe we'll measure, for lack of a better term, hotness. Okay, how hot is the instructor? And we'll gauge that by having him or her strut their stuff in a swimsuit. Okay, so then you have to ask yourself, is hotness, okay, this good-lookingness, something that correlates with high performance as a human resource management instructor? And I would say probably not. Okay, the way a person looks shouldn't really have any adverse effect on or positively and negative on how effective they are as an instructor. All right, so a swimsuit contest then, I'm just trying to wrap my head around that. A swimsuit contest then as a selection criteria for being a college instructor in human resource management would not be a valid method. All right, wipe your brain. Wipe your brain, because old guys in Speedos is not something you want to be thinking about for the rest of the day. All right, second criteria is reliability, and reliability deals with measuring something consistently. Okay, so reliable interview formats, different interviews come up with the same assessment of a particular candidate. Okay, so one way to ensure reliability is ask everybody the same questions, okay, because it's consistent, right? With the typing tests, what you might want to do is give them 2 or 3 chances and then take the average, okay, because then that would probably give you a more consistent idea of how fast they are on the typing test. Now the question becomes, what about the swimsuit contest? Always about the swimsuit contest. Could we reliably measure, okay, what we're trying to measure, which is hotness? And I would argue yes. Okay, you come up with a rubric, okay, because a lot of your instructors in their courses have rubrics for a assignment. You could have a rubric for the swimsuit contests. Okay, so one element of the rubric might be abs. All right, so the instructor is in his Speedo, we'll use male, and he's striking his stuff, and all right, count the number of abs. 6, 4, 2, or 1 giant ab, known as a beer belly. Another, harkens back to that old joke is, why settle for a 6-pack when you can have the whole keg? Har, har, har. All right, enough about abs here. Okay, so that rubric, I would argue, would allow you to measure hotness. And I think if everybody had the same rubric, that would be reliable. Okay, so even though the swimsuit contest might be a reliable method, okay, a consistent method for measuring hotness, it would not be a valid method, right? What have we got here? Generalizability can be used across a variety of contexts. Okay, so for example, a personality test which can be used for selecting both salespersons and managers. So you wouldn't want to come up with a personality test, just for one for servers and another one for, I don't know, janitors, and stuff like that. You want to have stuff that can be, used. So interview questions oftentimes are ones that can be very generalizable. You can use the question about, tell me about a time where you did something at work where you didn't have to, which measures, what's it, that's what I'm looking for. initiative, okay? That can be used over a wide number of jobs, right? So you want to have techniques that can be used in more than one context. Legal, all right, avoids violating laws, particularly human rights. I'll give you a reference in your textbook, 5.1, and privacy, and we kind of covered this in sort of a detail in the last one, so I'm not going to beat that one to death. And the final one is utility. It needs to be cost-effective and relatively easy to use. All right, so if you have something that's a really complicated test, for example, or something that's really expensive, if you had like a $1,000 psychological test, all right, would you want to use that if you were hiring, let's say, a custodian or a server at Tim Hortons? Probably not. That's not really cost effective, right? When I worked at the phone company way back when, we had a interview process where for every position, didn't matter if it was a telephone operator or the president, you had to have at least 2 different interviews by 2 different people, and those took about 2 hours each, and that was needlessly cumbersome. So the utility of that selection process of having those 2 interviews wasn't as cost effective as it should be. Sure, great if you're for a senior executive, but somebody for an entry-level position, not so much. All right, the key here then is you want to be using multiple selection methods. Okay, testing, interview, and reference checks are much more effective than relying on one thing. So just having interview only. So a good selection process will involve a number of different selection techniques or selection tools. Cycle back. Okay, define ways to measure success of the selection interview. Okay, so to recap, your selection method must be valid, okay, which is measuring what you purport to be measuring. So measuring something that's actually critical to success on the job. It must be a reliable measurement. So it needs to be able to measurably consistently. It needs to be easy for me to say, generalizable, okay? So robust, or use it in a number of different contexts. So, for example, an interview question you can use with almost any job. It must be legal, okay, goes without saying. And finally, it must be practical or cost effective. All right, I mean, that's another great exam question to use. Okay, we're on to objective number 3, which says compare some of the common methods for obtaining and verifying candidate information. So there's actually 2 things here. Is where do you get the information? Places like resumes or application forms. And the other part is verifying, which is actually a little out of order because this the objective 4 and 5 deal with tests and interviews, and verify usually do after 4 and 5, but for whatever reason, I guess we'll cover it within this objective, which is a little early. Okay, so start with applications and resumes. There are 2 ways to get information about the candidates after they've applied. Application forms, I think when you were a kid, maybe with your first job, and you maybe didn't have a resume when you were 13 or 14, you'd go to a place like, why not, Tim Hortons or Subway, and then you would you'd fill out a form, and that form on it would have some information which they would use to help decide whether you were capable of being a sandwich artist if you were at Subway, for example, right? So the advantage of an application form is that it collects all information in a standardized format. Everybody is putting the same information on the format, and it's in the same, in the same order, right? So it gives you a really good way to compare apples to apples, direct comparison, right? And really, it's useful for screening out candidates who don't meet the minimum requirements. Okay, so if the job requires something like a high school diploma, and it'll be really clear that you don't have the high school diploma on an application form, just if you didn't tick the box. Resumes, on the other hand, are the standard application tool for most jobs. So obviously, you all have a resume. I would hope you all have a resume by this point, because you'll need it if you ever want to apply for a job beyond something like the sandwich artist at Subway. The chief difference with the resume is the applicant controls the content and the format. Okay, so rather than having all the information sort of in a standard format, you can put the information in a way that makes you look better. Good example is for a lot of students, they like to put their education first, or recent grads, right? Because that's they lead with that, lead with the most, or the best thing about them. The best thing about them, or the most relevant reason why I deserve this job, is that I have a degree or diploma, right? Once you've been out in the work world for a while and you're competing for jobs where everybody has the degree or diploma, you might want to lead with your work experience, right? So you control the format and with the resume, the job seeker, and the way they do that, they'll put things on it in a way that makes them look a little bit better. The other advantage of a resume over an application form is it'll give you some insights into an applicant's written communication skills, like spelling mistakes, etc. So you're checking a lot of boxes on the application form. You actually have to write stuff on the resume. So those are the two main ways employers get information. The other one, which probably should have been on here, is a portfolio, particularly if the job is artistic or like an architect or something like that. So what a portfolio is just a collection of projects or works that you've done that you can show people, right? So that's a third way that you put on there. Now, somewhat related to this is something called an applicant tracking system. In the old days, we used to get a pile of resumes, and you'd pass the pile of resumes around from person to person, and that was a very inefficient way, I guess, of dealing with screening people. So with an applicant tracking system, is you take this information, you put it into a database of some sort, and that's really helpful. For one, you can share a lot easier electronically if you're just emailing or downloading resumes. So you don't have to have access to the paper file. The other thing an applicant tracking system can do is, even with people who you apply for jobs, but they may not be suitable for the job they applied for, but they might be suitable for another job. We had a young woman a number of years ago when I worked at Grand Prairie. She applied for a job in human resources. In recruiting, student recruiting, which I was on the committee for that, but she was really more qualified to do a job in human resources. So the applicant tracking system kind of saved her resume, and when an entry-level position in human resources came up about a couple months later, they got a hold of her, and she ended up getting that job. So again, it's just a really good way of using technology to simplify and make the system a lot better. You put the resumes and the job information into an applicant tracking system. Okay, so references and background checks. Like I said, these are usually performed after the tests and the interviews, okay, but they've chosen to deal with these right now. What do we say about those? Well, reference checks are useful to verify the accuracy of information provided by the candidate. And the second one is that it's better to restrict comments to verifiable information. I'll deal with both those two together, because often people references may be less forthcoming to give negative information about a person, right? So let's say, for example, you were checking the references of let's use a cardiovascular surgeon as opposed to a cardiovascular surgeon. We're talking about not a big fish sturgeon, we're talking about a surgeon, the human being here. Okay, so you are checking the reference of a cardiovascular surgeon. You could ask his former employer at the hospital questions like, did they work at the hospital? What were the dates they worked at the hospital? Did they in fact perform cardiovascular surgery? Did they show up for work on time? Okay. Why did they leave? All right, things like that. So those are really questions that are verifiable. And again, if you stick to that information, you'll get better information. Referees, like I said, a lot of times, if you ask opinion questions, they'll kind of shy away from that thing. All right, so that's what they suggest for reference checks. For many other jobs, a criminal records check, credit check, social media check, or driving abstract may be required if it's relevant for the job. So obviously, if somebody has to drive a company vehicle, having a driving abstract is certainly a good thing. A criminal records check, if you're working with people from vulnerable demographics, for example, like the disabled or younger children, right? Obviously, you want to make sure you have a criminal records check so there's nothing in a person's background that would have them working with these vulnerable demographics not be a good thing. All right, and the other part is you want to comply with privacy laws. So to do that, you must get an applicant's consent before conducting reference background checks. So your buddy might know the guy who's applying for the job, but unless the candidate has listed your buddy as one of the references, you're not allowed to go and get buddy to weigh in on the candidate, right? That's not kosher. Okay, so why do we do background checks, right? Why do we? Well, probably the biggest reason is a legal reason, and that's something called negligent hiring, okay? So an employee may be found liable, which means they could get sued for harm caused by an employee if proper reference or background checks were not performed. So for example, a school board will do a background check on potential teachers, because obviously you don't want to hire a convicted predator to teach at an elementary school. All right. Okay, cycle back then to learning objective 3. What do we want you to know from that? To recap, all right, first of all, the two types of the common methods of getting information for jobs are the resume and application form. Okay, know that the pluses and minuses of each. Sometimes a portfolio is used. And then verifying candidate information. Those are things like reference checks, social media checks, criminal record checks, driving abstracts, or even a credit check. Stick to verifying information. Stuff that's objective on those mostly, and again, get permission to check the references, right? Okay, learning objective number 4, and this deals with tests, and I love employment tests, okay? Why do I love tests? Because tests are really good for actually demonstrating skills and abilities, right? So as opposed to interview answers. So somebody could say, for example, in an interview, describe your crossbow skills. Oh, I'm an expert shot with a crossbow. I'm absolutely awesome. All right, so they've given you information about their crossbow skills. So that's one way of getting it, through an interview question. Another, probably better way of getting information about somebody's crossbow skills is actually setting up a target. All right, giving them 10 arrows and see how many bullseye they get out of 10. Okay, an actual performance test, right? So that's the advantage of a test, is where you actually demonstrate these skills and abilities. We don't have to rely on your word or even the word of somebody else's word there. Okay, there are a number of different types of tests: physical ability, cognitive ability, performance, personality, honesty, alcohol and drug, and medical examinations. And each one of these things we'll go through in detail. This is basically just a summary slide. So we'll dive into it. And we'll start with physical ability tests. Okay, so physical ability tests, that would be something like maybe doing a bench press. Okay, or being able to lift, you got to lift 30 pounds or 40 pounds or 50 pounds, or a 1.5 mile run, okay, to test your endurance, okay? A lot of these physical ability tests are morphing into more job performance tests, and I'll talk about that in a bit, right? Because particularly a lot of these physical ability tests can be subject to human rights complaints, right? Bench press, for example, women being smaller than men, the average woman being smaller than the average men will likely do more poorly on a bench press test. Okay, and again, races, Asians, for example, tend to be smaller than many of the other races. So again, Asians as a group might do more poorly on a physical ability test. So yeah, they're getting away from a lot of these more towards job performance tests, mostly because of human rights considerations. Cognitive ability tests, so these can be intelligence tests to measure your verbal, quantitative, or reasoning. So a good example of that might be something like, well, back in the old days, when I worked at the bank, if you were a teller, which I guess they now call customer service representatives, you actually had to do some addition and subtraction and multiplication. So giving you a quick math test or a basic math skills test would be something along the lines of a cognitive ability test for a job like a customer service representative. Job performance tests, these are my favorites, okay? So in a job performance test, what you do is give them a specialized task that's related to the job, all right? And I was, one of the things we started doing when I was a chair at Barren Prairie is we actually put a job performance test in our interview for instructors, and they hadn't done this before, and it's a real head scratcher to me, but it was really simple. It was just, we tell the candidate before they come to the interview is prepare to give a 5 to 10 minute lecture or lesson or lecture on the topic of your choice. And let me tell you, I mean, we could interview somebody for 45 minutes or an hour. You would find out a lot about them. You'd find out the best stuff about people in their 5 or 10 minute lesson or lecture, right? Because that's essentially a very, very big part of being instructors, being able to get up there and teach something to somebody. Okay, so that was a job performance test. A couple things, in-basket tests and work samples. So an in-basket items is what they do is give you sort of a bunch of tasks, okay? And if you're a manager, okay, so in your in-basket, you have to schedule a meeting, you have to deal with the decision, you have to discipline an employee, that sort of thing, right? So it's just kind of a simulation there. Work sample would be quite simply, if the job requires writing skills, ask the person to bring something they've written in as a sample of their work. Right? And what an assessment center is really just a bunch of different tests, job performance tests done over a day, for example. All right. Now, just to give you a really good example of a job performance test, I'm going to show you a little video here about firefighters. So rather than, again, the firefighters having to do a bench press or a 1.5 mile run, they do something called a fire combat test here. So
I have to remain motionless for 2 seconds, at which time that's going to count down just like it would on an HRA drag race. Once the lights turn green, the alarm goes off. They'll reach down and grab a 42-pound hotel pack, throw it on their outside shoulder, and go all the way up to the top of the tower. It's 41 feet from the ground to where their feet are at the top of the tower. They'll throw that hotel pack into a basket, lean over the rail, and grab a 5/8-inch sterling rope. Attached to the end of it is a 42-pound donut roll. They'll hoist all the way up to the top, over the rail, into a basket, and then they're going to come all the way down. They can skip as many steps as they want on the way up, but they have to hit every single step on the way down. Once they come down the tower, they'll jump on top of the Kaiser forcible entry machine, where they're moving a 160-pound steel beam, a total distance of 5 feet, with a 9.6-pound shot maul. Once they move it to 5 feet, they'll put the shot mile down on the line mat. They will run through the delineator course. They'll reach down and grab an 1 3/4 Neidner hose. They're going to drag that Neidner hose 75 feet through these saloon doors, open up that puck nozzle and hit the target until it goes down, at which point they throw the hose down and they'll head over to rescue Randy, a 175-pound, true-to-life, 6-foot-tall mannequin, and they're going to drag him 106 feet across the finish line. And they're trying to get the best time.
You got it, you got it, you got it, you got it!
The fastest guys do it in like a minute and a half.
Yeah. Okay, so that firefighters test there is a really good example of a job performance test, right? So if you want to wrap your head around that. Okay, a couple other tests. Personality inventories. It's a test to see whether you have a personality or not. Har har. Okay, finds applicants. Find applicants who have desired personality traits. The big 5. Okay, so one of the big 5 is might be extroversion. Okay. So if I'm putting together a personality, or if I'm trying to hire a salesperson, okay, one of the personality traits I'd want to have probably with this salesperson is extroversion. All right, so a personality a personality inventory would be able to do that, right? If I am hiring a counselor. Okay, empathy is one of the things I'm looking at. And again, a personality inventory would be able to measure the amount of empathy a person would have, right? Problem with some of these, if you've taken a lot of these, is you can fake them, right? So you can, you know the answers that they're looking for rather than the actual answers. Honesty, alcohol and drug tests, okay. What can you say about those? I know the RCMP used to use the honesty test, and one of the questions used to be, back when weed was illegal, have you ever smoked weed illegally? All right, which was kind of an interesting one there. I guess I'm not sure what the correct answer was with that particular one. You can use alcohol and drug testing if if it's a safety concern. Again, be careful with this with human rights. One of the things you can identify with an alcohol and drug test is perhaps the person is has a disability, which is an addiction problem there, right? In which case, then you have the duty to accommodate to a reasonable expectation, right? So again, be careful about alcohol and drug tests. It might be something that you'd want to do afterwards rather than before hiring. And you can have medical examinations, okay? So example might be an eye test or an ear test. Again, be careful with these. They might identify disabilities. So if you have an eye test, it's reasonable to, in most jobs, that they are allowed to wear corrective lenses, right? Or if you have a hearing test, it's reasonable in most jobs to allow them to use hearing aids in order to meet the standards. Okay, so let's take a look then at Learning Objective 4, the recap on that, about the tests. What do I want to say about that? Okay, so be familiar with the different types of tests, so physical tests, cognitive tests, personality tests, and why they are so awesome, because with a test, you are looking at actual performance rather than somebody's opinion of their performance, right? So again, I can tell you about my bow hunting skills, or I can get somebody to actually demonstrate that they can hit the bullseye 10 times in a row. Okay, I'm back. Now you got my face, which sort of disappeared for some reason from the last part of the last objective, but now you have my beautiful mug for Learning Objective 5. Nice segue. Discuss how to conduct effective interviews and make and communicate the selection decision. So there's two things here. The bulk of it is effective interviews, but there's a little bit at the end about communicating the selection decision. So let's dive into it here. So start with some general stuff about employment interviews. pretty much every job you will apply for or you will post and look for people will have an interview. And I think it's a lot like, it comes back to human nature. You know, most people, not all, but most people, before they buy something like a car, want to take a test drive, right? So for better or for worse, the employment interview is kind of like test driving the potential employee, right? So you want to kick the tires before you buy the vehicle here. Now, the thing about, so an interview is the most common selection technique. Pretty much have one in almost in every employment competition. But what are you really measuring with the employment interview? Well, you're trying to measure ultimately whether the person is suitable. But the answer is really with the interview technique by itself, you're measuring communication skills and interpersonal style. Okay, so if I have somebody interviewing for a ditch digger's position, right, and for a ditch digger, I'm mostly looking at somebody who can dig the ditch and fill out a few forms, right? Guess they got to get along somewhat with their boss and their coworkers, but that's not a huge thing, right? So, you know, getting them to do an employment test, like actually digging a ditch, is probably a better measurement for most of the job than interviewing, right? Because what I'm testing usually with interviewing is communication skills and interpersonal style. If the position is a salesperson, yeah, interview makes perfect sense, okay? Because communication skills and interpersonal style are really important, right? So I would argue that, you know, they are, even though it is the most common, it's overused and over-relied on in a lot of cases. But just keep in your mind, what are you really measuring here? And if you come up with that, you can use the interview a little bit better. Okay, other thing is interviews are costly. So managers' time, travel cost if you fly people in, and they can be subject to bias. Okay, and there's a whole bunch of different biases people have. And we'll get into more of those when we get to performance management. One of them is recency bias. So the most recent thing, the last thing they say is what you glom onto. Or primacy bias. If they say one thing a lot, you'll glom onto that particular one, right? So there's a number of different biases that come into play in interviewing, more so than in a lot of other selection processes. Okay, so to improve employer interviewing, you want to use focus. So basically your question should look for a specific skill or traits. They should have a structure, open body and close, and standardization. You should really put everybody through the same drill, right? Each person's asked the same questions. That's how you improve your interviewing skills. Okay, some advantages and disadvantages here. Went over these just earlier. Again, can be low in validity. Validity being what are you trying to measure? And if you're trying to measure job suitability, depending on the job, you're trying to measure job suitability and you're measuring interpersonal skills and communication styles, that might not be the most valid way, particularly if you're hiring ditch diggers. Yeah, so I think I covered a lot of these things in the previous slide here, but this is just a little recap of that. Okay, different types of interviews. Panel interviews, a team of interviews, interview a cam. These are very common these days, particularly in a college setting. I've interviewed for a number of positions in post-secondary, and the panel has been anywhere from 2 people to could be up to 9 people. I interviewed at Red Deer College once. They had it was a cast of thousands. They had 9 people in the interview, including a student, which I thought was really cool. Okay. Yeah, so these are more common. Again, 2 heads are better than 1. You get a bunch of people making a team decision. It's usually better than an individual decision because you get different points of view. And particularly if your workplace uses a team approach, a panel interview makes a lot of sense. 2 other major types: a situational interview, where you give the candidate a hypothetical work situation or question. Okay, what would you do if you caught a fellow employee stealing? All right. Yep. So these situational interviews are really good for testing somebody's thinking process. You know, if you could see how they work through a problem, if they think out loud, right? Sometimes also their creativity can be with a situational interview. Note a situational interview is what would you do? It's hypothetical. It's in the future, not what did you do. Now, what did you do is known as a behavioral interview. And remember this for a test or whatever, because this is important. These are kind of the gold standard questions, questions asked about past behavior. And the basis of behavioral interviews, or BBIs, they're called sometimes, behavior-based interviews, is that past behavior is a valid and reliable predictor of future behavior. So what you did in the past is a better predictor of what you'll do in the future rather than a situational, what would you do, okay? So what you actually did. Okay, and you've been to many interviews in the last 30 years, you probably run into these questions. Tell me about a time. Okay, tell me about a time when you had conflict at work. Tell me a time when you had to use creativity at work. Tell me about a time when you had conflict with a coworker. Okay, I'm starting to repeat myself here. All right, so these are behaviorally based questions. Again, gold standard. I would implore you to actually rely on these more so than situational interview questions. So they tend to be, like I said, the gold standard. Check the Blackboard site. There'll be a lot more detail on behavioral based interviews and interview structure, things like that. So that stuff is important. So make sure you look at that stuff. And a digital interview, so using audio and visual technology, so using things like Zoom. And again, especially with the pandemic, this is becoming way more common, and it's just a lot more convenient for everybody. It cuts down a lot of travel costs. Okay, interview questions. This is really important. Each question needs to measure something, so each question has a point. Okay, you might have a really cool interview question, but it's got to be measuring something. It's got to be measuring a competence, something that's got to relate it to the job. Really, really important. Here are 4 examples. If you want to measure creativity and self-perception, if you were a tree, what type of tree would you be? Well, sir, I would be a mighty oak who stands tall and firm and strong, blah, blah, blah. Okay, something like that. Okay. Measuring sales skills. Okay. Sell me this pen. That's a classic one for a sales, and then toss the pen at the person and see what they say. Measuring resiliency. Okay. Tell me about a time, and this is a behavioral-based question, when you failed at something. All right, so they'll go through that, and hopefully they'll tell you learn something at the end, right? So this can measure resiliency, your ability to bounce back after not succeeding. And measuring initiative. Tell me about a time at work when you did something you didn't have to. Okay, when you went above and beyond. Okay, which is a good way to gauge initiative. Note these last 2 are behavioral based, and these other 2 here are more situational, right? So you can have a good mix of interview questions, but again, I would encourage you to rely more on the behavioral based rather than the situational. Okay, other thing to remember, a test is often a more valid measure than an interview for many things. How many words a minute can you type? Oh, I can type 50 words a minute. All right, so put you on typing test and you do 30. Which one are you going to believe? Okay, obviously. So again, harkens back to what I said earlier. What you're measuring in an interview is your communication skills and your interpersonal skills, right? So if you can focus a lot of your questioning in the interview on those, you'll get better information. Okay. Couple interviewing tips then here. Obviously plan ahead. Each question needs to measure competency needed for the job. Okay, so structure the interview. And we're talking about structuring the interview. okay, what you want to do is you want to have, you know, a number of different sections. So generally what you do is the first few minutes, you break the ice. Hi, how are you doing? It's nice we're having weather, that sort of stuff. Second thing you do is orient the candidate, what to expect. Okay, so this is going to be about a 45-minute interview. We're going to ask you a bunch of questions about your resume and then some tougher questions. If it were a teaching interview, we'll have you do your little presentation. We'll give you a chance to answer questions, and then we'll wrap everything up. Okay, so just orient them and have a structure. Select a private and comfortable place. Don't allow for interruptions. So obviously you're not going to interview somebody in the middle of a crowded foyer. Sort of in a nice boardroom setting usually works well. Take and keep notes. Okay. Specifically, if you get called up sometime and you need to justify your employment decisions, you'll want to have notes. Or oftentimes people will have sort of a score sheet. Or evaluation sheet is a common thing as well. Allow enough time. Generally speaking, an hour is enough for most jobs. Maybe more, but an hour is a really good, allowing an hour is usually a good rule of thumb. And as always, you are representing the organization, so make sure you are professional. Okay. Selection decision. Okay, so this is the other part here about communicating the decision. Two major points here. The first one here is you can decide whether you have a multiple hurdle model or a compensatory model. Okay, so I'll give you an example of that. So let's say I'm interviewing for an instructor, and one of the things I really want is teaching experience. Okay, so under a multiple hurdle model, candidate A has some teaching experience and not great work experience. Candidate B has no teaching experience but kick-ass work experience. Okay, so in a multiple hurdle scenario here, I would eliminate candidate B, okay, because he doesn't have the teaching experience, right? Under the compensatory model, I wouldn't eliminate candidate B, okay, and I would allow for the fact that he has kick-ass work experience to compensate for the fact that he doesn't have teaching experience, right? So yeah, this is an on-off sort of thing, and the compensatory model as well will take a look at the whole person sort of thing, right? Okay, so there's two different ways you can do that. The other thing I want to talk here about the selection decision is, this is really important, is the HR person should make the formal offer of employment. We've talked a little bit about the common law employment contract, okay? And once you offer somebody a job, you're into a contract, right? And a contract has to have an offer, acceptance, consideration, and intent. And when you take legal studies, you'll remember that, right? So just to make sure that you've got everything in this contract that you want and everything's kind of kosher up front, get the HR, leave it to a professional to actually offer the particular job. And quite often, or what should be done, is an offer letter will dictate some of the key terms and conditions of employment, like pay and benefits, work responsibility, start date, etc. And this is really important. This really sets the terms of the common law in the employment contract. So yeah, get the HR person to do it and make sure you have an offer letter. Okay, then cycle back to learning objective 5 here. A couple things we want to talk about, or we talked about here, is first of all, the employment interview is more about measuring communication skills and interpersonal skills. So even though it's used in a lot of cases, really think about what you're measuring with it, okay? Quite often the tests or background screening can be as effective or more effective than an interview for a particular part of a job. Number 2, make sure you have focus. So your questions should all have a point, okay? They should all be trying to measure, one aspect of the job, like resiliency, for example, or like your experience with the teaching. So each question should have a point. There should be a structure, okay? Generally, you go from easier questions to harder questions. Okay. Yeah. And standardize. So make sure you ask the same question or run the each candidate through the same drill in order to make sure you have some consistency or reliability there. Use behavioral-based interview questions when you can. They tend to be better, more accurate than other types of questions. And communicating and selecting the decision is make sure the HR person does the offer and have a letter of offer to fill out the common law employment contract. All right, so lots of different stuff then in Chapter 5. Here's a quick summary here. Process of selection consists of sequence of steps. So know that sequence of steps. So you start with screening, then you have testing, you have the interview, reference checks, and finally the offer. So know how that works, be able to run a person through that. The success of a selection model can be determined based on the criteria. All right, so make sure you know your criteria of validity, reliability, generalizability, legality, and utility. Know those. Methods for selecting human resources have various strengths and limitations. Okay, so interview methods are things like interview tests and background checks. And again, yeah, tests, which is number 4 here. Really like those. They can be, yeah, really used, even more used than an interview in a lot of cases here. Yeah, and they're good, better than interview questions because they measure actual behavior rather than what somebody says their behavior is. And your last one is interviews. They're widely used. You're probably measuring communication and interpersonal skills, and make sure that you plan out your whole process, you know, with the questions and the sequence of questions and how the interview will get done within an hour. And that's Chapter 5. Chapter 6 deals with training, development, and orientation.